the question that came to my mind, and the question that we're posed with today is, why would the Roosevelt administration do this? Why would the Roosevelt administration make a public story of the nervous breakdown of one of their key cabinet members? And this is not a small cabinet member. This is the Secretary of State. You know, one would assume the Secretary of State would need to be a strong, healthy person to run the state. But no, this became a news item simply because he was not healthy. Teddy Roosevelt, nervous illness. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was no stranger to nervous illness. As a matter of fact, in 1884 was not a very good year for Teddy Roosevelt. On Valentine's Day of that year, both his wife and his mother died within hours of each other on Valentine's Day. A severe emotional blow to Teddy Roosevelt back in 1884. Now, that was followed a few months later by a very acrimonious infighting within the Republican Party, which was Teddy Roosevelt's party. So by the end of the year, Teddy Roosevelt had a breakdown. He simply did not want to leave his home. He couldn't bear to go talk to people. Life no longer had any joy. He had broken down. So what did people do back in 1884 when they started having breakdowns like this? Well, one of the most popular things for folks to do was to get out of the city, get away from the problems, and go out west, go camping. And that's what Teddy Roosevelt did. He spent over a year in the Dakota Territories working on a ranch. He helped rope cattle. He was even made into a sheriff, so he went out and he chased down cattle rustlers. He had gunfights. He was a lawman. And this fellow, who had a nervous breakdown in 1884, came back to politics on the East Coast a few years later, a new man. He'd reinvented himself as a cowboy. Now, before he returned from the West, Teddy Roosevelt had a reputation of being kind of a mama's boy. He loved his mother dearly. He had a shrill voice, which still you can go online and find some recordings, early recordings of him. And his voice was quite shrill. He wouldn't work well in modern politics with all the telecommunications we have today. But when he came back in 1886 to politics on the East Coast, he was a new man. He was a man not to be trifled with. He would give political speeches on how he raced down rustlers, how he shot people, how he has brought law to an uncivilized area of the Dakota Territories. And people on the East Coast ate it up. They loved it. And he was more popular than ever. I mean, his career took off after that. He was a police commissioner of New York City then. He was undersecretary of the Navy, and he eventually became vice president under William McKinley. And of course, when William McKinley was assassinated, this fellow who had a nervous breakdown went out west, served time as a cowboy, came back, now found himself president. President, you know, 15 years after his nervous breakdown. The idea of going out west as being vigorous was not new to Americans. In fact, Americans for a long time had a very special relationship with nature. Americans had long thought that nature could, invest health and vigor into them. I mean, even Teddy Roosevelt himself, he wrote a letter to his sister when he was out west, and he said, quote, "I have never been in better health. I am in the saddle all day long, either taking part in a roundup of cattle or else hunting antelope." So things like, raising cattle and hunting things was healthy for Roosevelt. And like I said before, this was not unusual. You just got to go back 50 years before this to the first part of the 19th century, and you're going to find the transcendentalists that go well into the late 19th century. People like Emerson and Thoreau, who talk about all that is right with the world, all that is right about America, could be found living in a cabin next to a small pond. Late 19th century people that picked up the mantle of the transcendentalists are naturalists such as John Muir. Now, John Muir became a name in American cities by the end of the 1890s. The Sierra Club he founded in the 1890s. He was one of the main advocates for getting national parks, such as Yosemite National Park, designated as such. In the Atlantic magazine in 1898, John Muir had to say this about nature, and especially listen to his language that he's talking about. He talks about, the nerves of America. John Muir said, "Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wilderness is a necessity, and that mountain peaks and reservations are useful not only as fountains of timber, but also of fountains of life. So as the 20th century approached, nature, mountains, the woods, forests started to take this new role in American life. I mean, it wasn't simply poets like the Transcendentalists and naturalists like John Muir that saw that there was something healthy about the wilderness, about being out in nature. One of America's foremost physicians, a man by the name of Weir Mitchell, who was a neurologist, and neurology was considered to be, the cutting edge of medical science in the late 19th century. Mitchell would often prescribe hunting and camping trips and fishing trips for people that came down with neurasthenia, that had nervous breakdowns and nervous illness. As a matter of fact, Mitchell talked about nervous breakdowns and nervous prostration as being the effects of civilization. Dr. Mitchell would write a number of popular health manuals, and he would describe this evolution of American society, of being pilgrims and frontiersmen and settlers, strong, people that never knew what a backache was, people that never knew what nervous illness was. But as soon as we started living in cities and doing jobs like at a desk and offices, using our brains rather than our brawn for our livelihood, then we started to get sick. It was thought that indigestion, that back pain, that depression, that insomnia and headaches were all modern illnesses. It was thought that the ancient Greeks never had these things. People would search literature, and they'd have a hard time finding backache references in literature. But it seemed like everyone in the 1890s living in a city had a backache. That was because we were living out of nature. We were living in cities. Now, this romanticism about the West, this romanticism about nature in America, reached a crisis point in 1893. 1893 is a date you could put a star next to that. Why? Because a historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a paper called The Frontier in American History. Frederick Jackson Turner came up with this historical thesis, which, for those of you that study history, Turner is like a rock star. And this was a time in which historians actually would be able to sell out, stadiums. Well, they didn't have stadiums. They would sell out auditoriums when they would go on speaking tours. And Turner was probably America's most famous historian at this time period. Turner, in 1893, gave a speech and wrote a paper in which he talked about the 1890 census. Now, every 10 years, the United States does a census to figure out how much land it has and how many people it has. And in 1890, it realized, the census did, that statistically speaking, America no longer had a frontier. Now, a frontier was a legal designation of land to population density. And areas that are not very densely populated are designated as frontiers. Well, in 1890, America had become so densely populated, the frontier no longer exists. Now, for people like Turner, this was a major issue, because Turner surmised that everything that made Americans great came from the frontier. Europeans didn't have a frontier. Americans did. The frontier brought the best out in Americans. It brought out our ingenuity. It brought out our strengths. It brought out our imagination. It was Americans working as settlers, with the frontier that made us the nation that we were. But in 1890, the frontier was closed. So by 1893, Americans were saying, what's going to happen to us as a nation? If we get sick with nervous illness and nervous breakdowns living in cities, and the frontier no longer exists, what is to become of us as a nation? Are we going to deteriorate? For a lot of Americans, this was an issue. This was an issue. Indeed, by 1900, neurasthenia, nervous prostration, had become a household name. You'd have to wait until the 1930s until people would actually start using the term nervous breakdowns. But by 1900, people were talking all the time about nervous illness and neurasthenia. It affected both men and women. Differently, but both of them would get it. Women supposedly would get nervous illness because they would spend so much time when they were younger, let's say in university classrooms using their brain, and not enough time, tending a garden, raising kids, and that all the energy went to the brain and not their womb, and for some reason they started running out of energy. And indeed, the word neurasthenia comes from Greek, meaning lack of nervous energy. It's all based on this paradigm of health that was very popular at the time period. This paradigm basically held that when we ate food, it went down into our stomach, and then our stomach converted it to energy. And then this energy was distributed through our bodies to our muscles and to our organs, our stomach, our brain, our backs, via the nervous system. So the nervous system acted as like electric wires. Now you have to remember, late 19th century, electricity was all the rage. You have people like Thomas Edison that are electrifying cities. So it was really easy to see our bodies as being like these electrical machines. So neurasthenia occurred when our energy ran low, when we did not eat properly, when we did not get enough exercise to store this energy, when perhaps we used our brains too much without compensating with using our body, then we would start to run low on energy. Grown men would cry, backaches, women would have amenorrhea, men would become impotent. All these were thought to be the same illness, all coming from the nervous system, and all being a result of civilization and urbanization. Indeed, if you look at who had neurasthenia, who had nervous breakdowns at the turn of the century, it's like a who's who of American culture. Names, big names include people like Jane Addams. Jane Addams was one of the most recognizable names in America, men or women. She was famous for her nervous breakdown. As a matter of fact, it was her nervous breakdown which sent her to Europe, where she became inspired to begin the settlement house movement within the United States. Other people such as William James, one of America's foremost philosophers / psychologists, academics. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was known for his nervous breakdowns. Edith Wharton, the rising stars in literature. Theodore Dreiser, also a rising star in literature. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a famous economist and feminist of the time period. Even Charles Schwab, who was one of America's foremost financiers. He ended up becoming the CEO of the first billion-dollar United Steel industry of Carnegie's. All these people had neurasthenia, and none of them kept it secret. It was almost like to have neurasthenia was to be fashionable. To go to a sanitarium was fashionable. It's kind of like today, all the stars in Hollywood, they go to rehab. I mean, what with the Grammys? Amy Winehouse, one of the biggest winners of the Grammys, performed at the Grammys a few days ago. Did she perform live? No. She performed with a telebroadcast because she was in rehab. In fact, the song she performed was called Rehab. So in the same way, rehab and having breakdowns and having addictions today is kind of fashionable with the rich and famous, and they don't hide it anymore. In the same way, having nervous breakdowns was somewhat fashionable at the turn of the last century. New York Times. New York Times ran an article in 1907, and its title was "The Problem of Finding an Adequate Cure for Our National Malady. Medical experts discuss Secretary Root's case as typical of disease common to Americans." And of course, that disease, which New York Times was talking about, that Elihu Root, the Secretary of State, had, that disease was neurasthenia. He had had a nervous breakdown, which now brings us back to Secretary Root, the Teddy Roosevelt administration, and nervous breakdowns. The Roosevelt administration tackled Elihu Root's nervous breakdown with much vigor. Of course, Elihu Root, the 62-year-old Secretary of State, articles at that time claimed that Root had come down with neurasthenia because he was overworked and because he was worried. Journalists interviewed William Muldoon. Now, William Muldoon was the leader of Muldoon Sanitarium that Elihu Root was sent to when he had his nervous breakdown. And William Muldoon, as quoted by the New York Times, said, quote, "When Root arrived, he was very weak and feeble. He was suffering from mental exhaustion. His nervous energy was worn out. His brain was tired. He was anxious about matters and that should not have worried him. When he went to bed, his mind was worried about things that did not exist." Now, since we all here are academics and scholars, I know that we've all experienced this as well, lying in bed, mulling over problems. If you're Secretary of State, I imagine that doesn't stop. These problems, by the way, as a little side note, what were these problems? Word on the street, at least the word in the LA Times that had a reporter in Wall Street, was that Elihu Root had his nervous breakdown because of Teddy Roosevelt's trust busting. Now, if you go back to your history class and think about Teddy Roosevelt trust busting, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican president that decided to kind of stick it to big business and break up a lot of the monopolies that there were along that time. Well, Elihu Root's best friends were part of big business. And he was supposed to be their man in the administration to kind of like reel back Teddy Roosevelt so he wouldn't be as tough on big businesses. Teddy Roosevelt wasn't listening to Elihu Root. He was being increasingly marginalized within the administration, and he had a breakdown as a result. Now, going to Muldoon's, that sanitarium that Root went to, was not simply a rest cure. It wasn't a chance for him to lay in bed and eat bonbons and rest. Now, that's the way people would have dealt with nervous prostration and neurasthenia 10 years before. But with Teddy Roosevelt, it was going to be a rigorous, strenuous cure that Root was going to have to go through. Now, William Muldoon himself, for those of you that might know his name, he was a championship wrestler turned personal trainer. Okay? He was a personal trainer at a sanitarium for the rich and famous that had their nervous breakdowns. Now, if news stories are to be trusted, each day Muldoon would personally put Elihu Root through the daily regimen, which included 20 miles of horseback riding, 3 to 5 miles of walking, a couple of hours of boxing, often with Muldoon himself, and milking cows every morning. Now, this is kind of a get back to the land type sanitarium. Get rid of the city, get rid of your cares, your worries, your cares. Milk cows, box. Here's a martial spirit coming in. You might not be able to hunt things in Muldoon's farm, but you can certainly fight. 20 miles of horseback riding, 2 to 3 miles of walking a day. And keep this in mind, Elihu Root was 62 years old. New York Times described this routine as, quote, as strenuous as the administration of which Root was part, which of course was the Roosevelt administration. See, these news stories are stressing how what Root was going through was very Roosevelt-esque. As the Roosevelt was known for his rough and tumble, rough and ready, big game hunting self, he was going to make his administration similar to him. Now, what were the results of Muldoon's regimen? Well, again, if news reports can be trusted, Muldoon told a reporter that Root was, each day, gaining 1 pound. This was a time in which being heavy and being kind of rotund was considered healthy. Right? You didn't want to be thin. That wasn't healthy. Having a belly, being kind of big, was healthy. So gaining 1 pound a day. Muldoon said this to reporters. And of course, this was reported to the American people then. If the president calls a meeting of the cabinet, Mr. Root will be, with the exception of the president only, about the strongest man around the table, not even barring the marvelously vigorous Secretary of War. That marvelously vigorous Secretary of War. Does anyone know who the Secretary of War was under Roosevelt's second administration? Taft. Does anyone know how marvelously vigorous Taft was? Yeah, he was 6 feet tall, 340 pounds. I mean, picture Shaquille O'Neal with a foot taken off, foot and 1 inch taken off his height. Okay? He was that big, marvelously vigorous. So again, these are the days in which being large was considered healthy. You were full of energy if you were big. The skinny person was the one without energy. And it's interesting. You can, as a side note, you can go back, and there's a lot of good history has been written on why skinny was considered unhealthy at the turn of the century. Suffice it to say, it has to do with tuberculosis and associations with skinny people as being unhealthy. So the tubercular person isn't big, because later stages of tuberculosis, it actually consumes your body. Anyway, so stories like this were going out about Secretary Root, Roosevelt taking care of Root. Now, Root was not the only person within the administration that was sick. A few weeks later, the LA Times ran a report that said that General J.F. Bell, who was Chief of Staff of the Army, also had a nervous breakdown. General Bell is the latest high Washington official to succumb to the strains of overwork and worry, the LA Times reported. In addition to that, the LA Times even reported that Bell was staying in the same room as Secretary Root. It's almost like the Roosevelt administration had a room reserved at Muldoon Sanitarium to take care of all their administrative and high officials that were having nervous breakdowns. And it wasn't simply the men. It wasn't simply the men. The New York Times ran a fascinating article that was called "The Strenuous Side of Social Life at Our Nation's Capital," in which it talked about the wives and daughters of these Washington officials, how rigorous their lives are as well. They're not out hunting big game, but rather rigorous life for these Washington wives was social events. Having to make sure that everyone was sitting next to the proper person at social events, remembering people's names, making sure that the food was there on time, the caterer was doing their job, etc. And how this was stressful. It was so active that women were having nervous breakdowns. Now, this article went through and gave examples of the various women in Washington and also told what these women were doing to help stave off neurasthenia and fortify their nervous system against the rigors of Washington life. For instance, here's the introduction to the article I think is interesting. New York Times stated, "Nervous prostration is the specter which haunts nearly all women who have endured the grinding fatigue of a Washington official season. 2 of the cabinet hostesses are practically on the individuals in the invalid list." Now, Mrs. Roosevelt, it went and it gave a little expose on Mrs. Roosevelt. It had this to say: Mrs. Roosevelt bears testimony that to be with the President of the United States is indeed the greatest honor which can come to womankind. But it entails hardships which the general public little dreams of. Mrs. Roosevelt, doing all the things a First Lady has to do, was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, so she devised a great way to go out and be active. While her husband would go on hunting expeditions, Mrs. Roosevelt would do something very 20th century. She would engage in what were known as shopping expeditions, where she would go out with some of her best friends, walk around the department stores and the shops, and buy things. And so in so doing, she'd have to use her brain and use her imagination as to who would like what president. She would talk about how she would buy things well before Christmas time and birthdays, and she would get a lot of footwork done. And sometimes she'd even carry some of the stuff that she bought. So that was good activity that staved off nervous illness from Mrs. Roosevelt. Mrs. Taft, the wife of Secretary of War, the big rotund Mr. Taft. New York Times had this to say about Mrs. Taft. It described her as, quote, a fragile-looking woman. Fragile-looking woman. If you have a man that big in your life, he probably gets most of the food, so you're going to be fragile. What would she do? The New York Times talked about how she would run 8 to 10 miles a day. She would run, excuse me, stop, rewind that. She would row a boat 8 to 10 miles a day. And frequently, she would challenge her 16-year-old son to competitions of strength, like who can row the fastest. So here you have a wife of the Secretary of War that rows as a daily regiment, even with her 16-year-old son. So she's, a vital woman. Mrs. Root, the wife of the Secretary of State that had the nervous breakdown, she was described as, quote, one of the most delicate women in Washington. She steadied her nerves. She steadied her nerves by studying French and German. So she wanted to keep her brain active, doing something other than the worries and the concerns of dealing with social life. And her daughter, Miss Edith Root, would run cross country, and when President Roosevelt needed a genial riding partner, he would ask her to ride with him, rough and ready rides. So, the daughter would ride horses with the president. She would do cross-country riding. And Mrs. Knox, who was wife of the former Attorney General, she had probably one of the most interesting things she would do to prevent nervous prostration and having a nervous breakdown. She had a nervous breakdown, then she went to Florida to rest, but that wasn't helping her. So she went up to Pennsylvania to her son's dairy farm at Valley Forge, and she started to manage her son's dairy farm. She would read the latest journals and books about scientific management of farming. She would even churn the butter herself, and she would personally supervise the milk cows. That made her strong. And the New York Times said, quote, when she returned to Washington, she looked like a blooming 20-year-old girl. And she declares that at the first signs of symptoms, she will head back to her family farm and assume the role of dairymaid once again. So she would manage a farm, make her better, go back to Washington, and when she started to swoon again, she'd go back to the farm. Fascinating. I find it fascinating. So, where are we now? What types of things can we really draw from this? Nervous breakdowns, neurasthenia, nervous prostration within the Roosevelt administration. These are not things that are being shuttled away or hidden from the population. Rather, a lot of articles are being leaked to the press and guided by the Roosevelt administration as to how to deal with and how the Roosevelt administration is dealing with this, this nervous illness in their ranks. So I think one of the key things that we can look at is how the Roosevelt administration, how Teddy Roosevelt himself controlled the story on these. First of all, these stories made Roosevelt look like a taskmaster. Okay? Roosevelt was driving his cabinet so hard that they were having nervous breakdowns. This translates to the administration is working hard for the American people. Now, why would this really resonate with Americans in like 1907, 1906? Why is it the fact that the president is asking a lot of his administration be somewhat notable? Well, for that, you got to know what the presidency, what the government was like before Teddy Roosevelt. The late 19th century was known as a Gilded Age. It was well known for its corruption and the government doing absolutely nothing. People would be elected, they'd go to Washington, D.C., they'd sit on their hands and get kickbacks from big business and do nothing. It was labor unions and big business were duking it out to decide who guided American society and American, the development of American society and the economy. Roosevelt sent a signal that this was not business as usual. Rather, it was a new era of government, and that he was going to be working hard for the American people. It was going to be a rigorous administration that was going to take action. So the pure fact that his cabinet officials are keeling over with nervous breakdowns was actually a sign not so much that he employed weak men, but rather that he was driving his men hard. Why? To work for the American people, right? This is what you elected him to do. So it sent the right impression that he was a government of action. No more do-nothing presidency. So in that hand, as a taskmaster, it really improved and gained political equity within the United States. Also, these stories talked about Roosevelt and his administration as being models of good leadership. Models of good leadership. The articles stressed how Teddy Roosevelt took a personal interest in the health of Elihu Root and also General Bell. This is modeling good behavior because this was a time in which, within American business, the captains of industry, or robber barons, depends on what side of the tracks you were, had a reputation of not giving a damn about their employees, working their employees into the dirt. America had just huge numbers, double the casualty rate on on-the-job accidents than Europe even had at this time. So what Roosevelt is doing is modeling what it means to be a good employer by worrying about the health of your employees, like he was worrying about the health of Elihu Root. Also, it sent the message that in the same way he was looking after the health of his own employees, he would also look after the good health of the American people. Right? Just like he was a father figure to his cabinet, he was also a father figure to American people. And that, Teddy Roosevelt wanted to give the impression that he was the right man to have, at the rudder of the ship of state, that he will guide America. He's someone that can be trusted. He's someone that's going to be keeping Americans healthy. Also, I think Teddy Roosevelt and a lot of intellectuals of the time period saw nervous illness, nervous breakdowns, neurasthenia, as kind of a harbinger of the future, almost like the ghost of Christmas future, and what might happen if we don't do things now to prevent the nation from being just a bunch of nervous invalids, where men and women are having nervous breakdowns on a regular basis. So by evoking nervous illness, and also within the American media, talking about how this could be dealt with, how it could be treated, Roosevelt was able to further his vision for the future and his vision of what should happen in America and what America should look like. For instance, the National Forest Service. Now, I've already talked about how important the forest and the frontier and nature was to American livelihood. Within the American and Romantic imagination, nature and forests were kind of the wellspring of health and vigor for the nation. Teddy Roosevelt was the president which established the National Forest Service. He set aside over 100 million acres of natural untouched lands for the National Forest Service. And he put very able people such as Gifford Pinchot in charge of the forest to make sure that the forest would be there for future generations, so that when we would become sick from living in the cities, we can then leave the cities on vacations and take holidays in the forest to kind of get in touch again with our frontiersman settler roots. Also, Teddy Roosevelt, an exercise. Teddy Roosevelt, as a man, was well known for his exercise. Reporters loved to come out and watch him box. He would pull, Taft out there, and Teddy Roosevelt would take pot shots at Taft. I mean, this is something that it's kind of funny, but he would box for reporters on the White House lawn. He stressed how much he could lift, these types of things. He became, in essence, a poster child for physical education within the United States. And indeed, this is the very time period in American history in which a movement called physical culture was really taking shape. Bodybuilders, people that were gurus of health, names such as Bernard McFadden, Eugene Sandow, and later their pupil, Charles Atlas, later on in the 20th century, would stress how strong people are good Americans and how we have to look after our bodies. And it's not simply the idea of physical exercise as being healthy, which indeed in public education you start having incorporation of physical education as being part of the school curriculum right around this time as well. It's not only physical exercise and physical culture, but also concern over diet, and medicine. Neurasthenia supposedly was caused by bad diets, people eating greasy, pre-made processed foods like we're doing here. This is a time in which Americans were no longer eating as much roasted meat that came off the fire, but now they're eating hot dogs and sausages made in places like Chicago. Around this time was also when the book The Jungle came out by Upton Sinclair, and Americans learned about all the nasty stuff that went into our processed foods. It's not a coincidence that this is all tied up with the idea of the health of the urban American who eats these processed foods. Teddy Roosevelt in 1906 pushed through Congress the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, which was there to regulate and make sure the food Americans ate was healthy. And not only the food that Americans ate, but the medicine we took into our bodies, that we knew what we were taking into our bodies. One of the most popular cures for neurasthenia, for those that couldn't afford to take time off work to go camp, for those that couldn't afford to go rest and convalesce in Europe, one of the most popular cures for someone feeling down and on the verge of a nervous breakdown was medicine, patent medicine. I mean, the Rolling Stones talked about, Mother's Little Helper. Other people have sung about being on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Patent medicines in the late 19th century were legendary for how they would feed Americans opium, alcohol, cocaine in order to liven our spirits, give us energy, or just make us go to sleep easier. The Pure Food and Drug Administration was Teddy Roosevelt's way of trying to control that and cut down on the addictive, harmful medicines Americans were taking to cure their neurasthenia. Before I fully end today, I just want to bring a few afterthoughts in, maybe points for a discussion. The Teddy Roosevelt administration, what can we learn from this, from what I talked about? What can we take away? The Teddy Roosevelt administration, I believe, acts as a model for how health issues can become motivations for change, how health issues can spur people to reform themselves. I think that today, government officials stay away from health at all costs. I mean, there's the healthcare policy issues which people talk about, but that's something that Republicans in the administration would rather let be, and Democrats, are arguing over what's the best policy. But actually diseases are not being discussed at all. Diabetes, obesity, autoimmune conditions such as chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, HIV, AIDS. These are things which undoubtedly members of the president's cabinet have suffered from one time or another, or have family members that have suffered from, but they're not getting front page news like nervous breakdowns were during the Roosevelt administration. Post-traumatic stress disorders as well. We're just starting to hear about this as veterans are coming back from the war. And of course, after the Vietnam War, we heard about it as well. But I'm interested to see whether anything actually comes about it from a kind of a top-down governmental point of view. Depression. Depression is another one. I mean, think back to 1972. Presidential election year, 1972. The vice presidential candidate of George McGovern is a guy named Thomas Eagleton. Thomas Eagleton initially was supposed to be the vice president running under the McGovern ticket. A story was leaked that Eagleton had depression and went through electroconvulsive therapy the previous decade. That was stigmatic enough that he had to drop out of the race because he had depression and he saw treatment. Compare that with Teddy Roosevelt administration, where the treatment meant that they were doing something good and helping improve society and individuals. Think also to 1988. 1988, another presidential election year. A story was released that Michael Dukakis had visited a psychologist after the death of his brother, which makes sense to a lot of us. But a lot of people in America and his political opponents spun this to mean that he's psychologically unsound for the job of president. We are hiding from these issues of nervous breakdowns, of depression, of chronic illnesses, and they are just not being touched by politicians and by politics. Because to admit any type of unhealth is to admit kind of weakness today, which I'm not sure if that is proper. And it's amazing how far we've come from the Roosevelt administration to today. I mean, can anyone even remember the last time it was reported that a member of Bush's cabinet was sick? Outside of maybe like, you know, breaking an arm because of a biking accident. He was so vigorous he was biking and he breaks a bone. So I'm going to leave you with that. And I've got some slides I can show also, but I'm going to grab is there any pizza left or is it all gone? It's gone? Is there oh, I got my coffee. I don't need soda. Okay, so any questions or comments as I try to get this PowerPoint thing going? Yeah?
About neurasthenia, was it something that tended to be associated with upper middle class and upper class members of society? Or?
Excellent question. Excellent questions. Much of the literature, historiography and literature on neurasthenia, academic literature today, has posed it mainly as this upper class, middle upper class illness. You know, they have too much time on their hands and they don't know what to do with it, so they become depressed, they languish. However, a lot of the research I've done is I've found that it's definitely not the case. There was a good book written by a guy, F.G. Gosling, that actually looked at medical records, published reports, and found that a lot of working class people had neurasthenia as well. And I did a lot of research at a free clinic in San Francisco from 1880s all the way till 1920s. And neurasthenia was one of the most commonly diagnosed illnesses of people coming into the free clinic. So the literature by scholars today tend to focus on those that we know. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, for instance, Theodore Dreiser. These are the people that have written about their lives, have done things. They usually come from the middle to upper classes. But there's a whole other story out there of the working classes as well. Yes, and then yes.
Wasn't there a kind of return to the farm or to country in the 18th century as well? I mean, it wasn't just a 19th century innovation, was it? I'm thinking of like in Versailles where they built these zillion-dollar fake barns so that the queen can go out and pretend to melt.
And she can pretend that she's a little farm girl and she has her lovers coming. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. This is cyclical. This is cyclical. As a matter of fact, there was an illness called the English malady that was very popular in the late 17th century, so late 1600s into the 1700s. And interestingly enough, this English malady blossomed after a number of major economic downturns, including like the tulip bulb boom and stuff like that, where all these English upper class people that had lost a lot of money started to languish, and they would go to these spas, like in Bath, for instance. So yeah, get out of the city, go back to the country, and exercise and eating even vegetarian diets have a cycle. Every 80 years or so, vegetarian diets become really popular. So yeah, there is a cycle there. Yeah.
What happened to this disease as a concept?
Good question. A lot of scholars are kind of debating what happened to it. In essence, what happened is it became parsed out. So neurasthenia, a lot of people considered it either an umbrella term or a waste bin term, depending on whether you think it was useful or just a waste. But by the 1930s, a lot of other advancements in medical science had divided up neurasthenia into more specific diagnoses. Obvious ones are Freud, psychoanalysis, and talking about psychosomatic disorders. Other ones are people discarded to it was the first few years of the 20th century that vitamins actually became identified. So a lot of these things that made people, sick and lethargic were seen as vitamin issues. Also hormonal issues. And today, you just got to look at chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, clinical depression, irritable bowel syndrome. And all these things that were all considered one symptom under the idea of nervous energy. Once the paradigm of health of nervous energy started to disappear, it became, various other things in the 20th century. Then we don't have, we don't have a diagnosis so much. It's still being diagnosed, evidently, in large numbers in China because it works well with Chinese notions of traditional medicine.
You mentioned this nervous energy. Was that related at all to Descartes' notion? Because Atreides of man, he has a similar notion that you have this filtering of the psychic pneuma in the it goes out through the brain, through the rest of the body, and is what's moving the muscles.
Yeah, well, I'm not a incredibly savvy on Descartes. I mean,
Where did this physiological model come from? Because it does.
It was
in the
it was conflated.
17th century.
It was conflated. At this point, I mean, I know Descartes had kind of the mind and the body separation, but most doctors in the late 19th century saw mind and the body as one and the same. They did not see that what the thoughts of the mind would harm the body in kind of a psychosomatic way. That's 20th century. They didn't see that as happening so much as if you're thinking these thoughts, it drains energy from the rest of your body, physical energy that you can light a light bulb with. And that's then where the connection between the mind and the body would be. But for the most part, mental illness and physical illness was conflated by a lot of doctors at this time period.
It sounds like it came from a lot of, I mean, Galen talks about psychic pneuma, which is where I think Descartes gets his concept of that similar flowing throughout the body.
Well, you know, I'm not sure how to exactly where it fits in with that. I know that they talked about some mysterious energy that was probably electrical. A lot of doctors presume that future medical science will exactly nail it down and figure out the meaning of it. But since that energy was not figured out by Western doctors as a paradigm, it just kind of disappeared. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how you brought up Roosevelt's interest in conservation along with us. I mean, there are a lot of, I'm sure you realize, but maybe a lot of people in here don't, maybe figuring it out, the real elitist nature of the emergence of the National Park Service and the national monuments, you know, whether it's medical or ecological preservation. I grew up in Wyoming, where of course we had Devil's Tower, the first monument, and Yellowstone, the first national park. If you look at you know, the photographs and early records of these places, it's as he pointed out, who's who of American culture and society coming out to enjoy these places. And it's you know, they didn't become really public places or proletarian in nature for several decades.
Yeah, it took roads going in.
Yeah.
Do you know this? Thanks. It took roads going in, and especially, you know, in the 1930s with the New Deal, you have a lot of these parks that were well established. I mean, the story about the development of the parks, it was considered there's been some great histories on it, and it's bringing together strange bedfellows, because you have people that are not elites, like John Muir, that, you know, he was an Indiana guy, wasn't he? And then he went up to Canada.
1,000-mile walk to the Gulf.
He's actually Scottish.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, he's Scottish, but I guess he had an injury here in Indiana, and he went up to avoid the Civil War in Canada, and then he tramped around through Florida, took a steamer to California, and, you know, this is not an elite guy, but he held the imagination because he was a good writer, and he would write about his experiences within the mountains. So a lot of middle-class folks were inspired by his depictions of mountains and nature. Now, him and his followers, Sierra Club folks, meshed together actually with what was known as the Boone and Crockett Gun Club. Now, the Boone and Crockett Gun Club were a bunch of Washington folks, you know, men in Congress, etc., that like to go out hunting together. And they wanted to preserve nature for hunting. So you have this naturalist, and Muir claimed he never carried a rifle in his life when tramping through forest, who became a political ally with these really elite who's who of hunting that wanted to preserve forests so that you'd have good game in the future, you know? And they came together, and using the political pull of these gun types in the Boone and Crockett Club, they were able to push through this stuff through legislation, which really angered the industrialists, because people still wanted to strip mine and do stuff like that there. All right, what do we have? Okay. Yeah.
So you mentioned celebrity rehabilitation. I was wondering if you see any other parallels to be drawn between today's celebrity health issues and what you were talking about. Any substantial parallels, or just a superficial observation?
Well, you know, I don't know. I think when it comes to lifestyles, the idea of being overworked and overworried, you read up on why people went into rehab. And they used to say went into rehab to take care of addiction. But nowadays, they're going into rehab, they just say because of exhaustion, and you know, it's surmised that they're dealing with their exhaustion through drinking or taking sleeping pills or something like that. I don't know, I think it's a sign of the times. But then again, it's always something, right? It's always something. You know, there could be a lot of interesting cultural studies on that. Maybe the idea of seeing weakness within our celebrities somehow makes them closer to us, And in the reality TV, reality world we're living in, we like to think, oh, you know, they're human as well. It makes them more accessible, but at the same time, they're on a pedestal. How about you? Did you see any connections there?
I was wondering if it was maybe opening up the grounds for these issues to be discussed.
Oh, definitely. I would agree with that 100%. And that's one of the things I'm talking about. The Roosevelt administration opens up the grounds for things to be discussed. I mean, often it's the celebrities, people coming out of Hollywood that are considered, you know, whether it be their sexuality or whether it be, you know, their what they do with their leisure time, which are considered a little out of the mainstream. But when they hit the news, even if it's tabloids, it becomes mainstream. All right. How about some images here? Can you lower the lights a little bit? Just lower these lights, maybe. Sure. Oh, whoa. That's good, but you might want to turn something on so someone can take notes. Okay, here you have some images from the time period. These are all by Thomas Eakins. Now, Thomas Eakins, one of the foremost portrait artists in America at the turn of the century, and he would, on a regular basis, portray his subjects as being kind of neurasthenic, as looking just fatigued. I mean, here you have one of Van Buren. There she is. She's looking fatigued. It's like there's something weighing on her mind. You know, like compare this with the Dutch artists a few hundred years earlier, where there'd always be the woman there with a letter, right? These are tropes which artists would use. And within America, it would show fatigue. And of course, when Eakins wasn't showing fatigued men and women, it would show them doing something physical, like trying to overcome the fatigue, like rowing. Or even Eakins loved just to kind of do the male body doing calisthenics. So again, this was fashionable. If you're going to have your picture painted, it would be looking kind of neurasthenic. Here are some pictures of Teddy Roosevelt here to just try to communicate to you how his image was everything for Roosevelt. This is shortly after. This is around 1886, a young Roosevelt after he came back from Dakota. He's got the full get-up going. He's got the buckskin. He's got his rifle. I mean, this is something. You want this man to be the chief of police in New York City. I mean, heck, the cowboy president is big. We got Ronald Reagan was a big cowboy president too, right? And even George Bush, our president George Bush, talks about going to Texas, clearing brush, being a cowboy, do it your own. Here's Teddy Roosevelt riding his horse vigorously, and there he is as a military man, you know, always rough and ready, boundless energy. And here's Elihu Root. Again, it looks like a Thomas Eakins portrait because Eakins really did, set the standard there. But it's not. But he has that tired look. This was done in 1907, the same year that he had his nervous breakdown. So maybe that's not an idealization of him, but maybe that's really how he looked when he was sitting for his portrait. And here's Muldoon, folks. Here's Muldoon. Look at him as contrast. This man would whip your butt into shape. Championship wrestler. He was a fighter, and it's interesting. Fighting back then, I mean, it wasn't until the early 1890s really that you started having Queensberry rules like this. Muldoon got his start in pit fighting, where he would have to be a wrestler, more Greco-Roman type fighting, and Muldoon's lasting contribution to health in America is the medicine ball. This was his invention. We still have medicine balls today. You can even go to the sports center here and look in that cupboard and see some medicine balls. And I like the image. They have him posing kind of in this like neoclassical thing, re-evoking the days of yore, going back to a time before we were so civilized and neurasthenic. And here, this is the last picture I got. Here's Teddy Roosevelt and his new best friend. Anyone know who that is? Muir. That's John Muir. Yeah, a famous photo. They are standing on a rock in Yosemite, California. And this is a famous stone. If you can get to the top of it, this rock juts right out over a sheer cliff. And if you go online and type up Yosemite and look at the various pictures, especially if you look at Yosemite history or historical, you're going to find crazy people doing crazy things on that overlook. People like, there's one of 3 women all standing on their hands on the rock that just hangs over. People standing there waving. And there they are. It's a sheer cliff going down. Here's Yosemite Valley, which later you'd have Hetch Hetchy. You'd have actually, it would be flooded for a reservoir. That's a very big controversy in California the first few decades of the 20th century. And Muir was, the Sierra Club was part of that, while trying to fight it. Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
So, Alan mentioned that John Muir is looking pretty scrawny there, but I'm wondering if his beard compensates.
You know, this is something. I, as a guy that only shaves once a week on Mondays, I really want facial hair to come back. You know, what is it, Thomas Dewey, the guy Truman beats Dewey, that lost to Truman. He was the last presidential candidate that even had facial hair, and he had a little mustache. Yeah, 19th century, having a beard was synonymous with being close to the land. I mean, you can do cultural histories, and I'm sure there have been on fashion and facial hair. But if you were sporting a beard, not only did it show some sort of virility, but it showed a certain connection to the land, which also reflects some sort of virility. I mean, today, it depends on how your beard is. It could be kind of counterculture, or it could show, you know, I mean, geez, remember the days when the bounty man used to have a beard? Now the bounty man doesn't have a beard. What's happening? But yeah, maybe the facial hair compensates. It's interesting, this suit is kind of famous in the history of John Muir. He was so excited he got to meet the President of the United States. John Muir, he raced out, and John Muir is a guy that would like forget to tie his shoes, right? He'd forget to eat sometimes. And he raced out and he bought a suit. He just said, I want that suit. And he bought it without trying it on. And he took it home, and his wife was saying, it doesn't fit you. Oh, my God. And supposedly it was this like burnt yellow suit. It was kind of a yellowish brown suit. It really looked god-awful. And he got a hat that didn't quite match the suit, but he was very proud of his suit. And evidently he would trot this suit out at all formal occasions. It was like his suit, the John Muir suit. Skinny, scrawny guy, but he's got his beard. Teddy Roosevelt's got his mustache and his riding pants. Isn't that it? All right, well, thanks for showing up, humoring me.